Welcome back to Pokemon Episode Summaries. Today, I'll be doing episode 230, Extreme Pokemon. The episode begins with Ash and the gang walking down a winding valley path as they then spotted a mountain in the distance, which Brock read in his guidebook that Mahogany Town was just over. Ash and the gang were almost there. However, Brock also read in his guidebook that there was a town before they would reach the mountain, which Ash and the gang also saw in the distance. Brock then reads that the town was apparently known as Eggster, and Ash and the gang immediately hoped that there was food in the town, or a restaurant, since they were hungry as fuck from all the walking, and hearing the name Eggster made them think of scrambled eggs. Just as the town finally became closer, as they were about to enter it, they heard a shouting voice and saw an Arcanine run past them. Ash instantly recognized the voice as belonging to Gary, and sure enough, Gary passed by as the Arcanine pulled him around on a skateboard. Ash calls out to Gary just before he passes by, and this causes Gary to recognize Ash and immediately stop his Arcanine. Because Arcanine was so fast though, it had already sped past Ash and the gang, so Ash and the gang still had to run to catch up to Gary, but once they did, they agreed to each other. Ash points out how Gary had clearly been training his Arcanine, with Brock and Misty adding that the Arcanine was clearly trained well, leading Gary to reveal that that wasn't the only thing he was doing, as he had been collecting a whole bunch of Johto gym badges, with Ash confirming that he had done the same, and stating his want to finally have a battle with Gary to see if these gyms had made each other even stronger. Unfortunately, Gary declined the battle request, though not out of disrespect for Ash, but because he was training for an event called the Extreme Pokemon Race, and stated that he didn't want his Arcanine to potentially get injured in battle before the race. Ash was curious as to what this race entailed, so he tried to ask Gary, but Gary simply stated he had to get back to training, and rushed off as his Arcanine pulled him down a cliff, being able to land perfectly due to Arcanine's skills. Ash and the gang try to give chase to Gary, but stop as to not kill themselves by falling off the cliff. However, when they look down the cliff, they spot not only Gary practicing, but also a whole bunch of other trainers practicing, having their Pokemon pull them on skateboards as well, particularly a dude with his Scyther. After this, Ash and the gang finally made their way to Eggster Town, where, much to their delight, they found a restaurant, and Brock and Misty instantly chowed down and enjoyed their meal, expecting that Ash obviously would as well. However, Misty noticed that, despite eating, Ash still looked extremely concerned, and he didn't even look like he enjoyed the meal that much, leading Ash to reveal that it was because he had something on his mind, which was whatever Gary was doing. He was very curious as to finding out what the race entailed, and further stated how he wanted to try and enter the race to compete against Gary, to try and beat him and show him up, but he had reservations about entering whatever this race was, since he had noticed that Gary had put a collar on his Arcanine, so he figured that maybe Gary was forcing his Arcanine to enter the race, as were all of the other competitors, and he didn't want to join a race that essentially promoted Pokemon slavery. Brock and Misty assure Ash that he was probably worrying over nothing, and stated that the Arcanine seemed to enjoy pulling Gary around on the skateboard. Suddenly, a man came up and sat by them at the lunch table, overhearing what they were talking about, and confirmed that yes, Pokemon loved the Extreme Pokemon Race. Assuming that this man must have known about the race, Ash takes the opportunity to eagerly ask him what it was, to which the man gives an exposition dump explaining it. Essentially, Extreme Pokemon used to actually be a means of transport, in which it involved trainers getting on their Pokemon and having them transport them to do deliveries and shit. But after all of the trainers realized how much fun they were having riding with their Pokemon, having them pull them around, they decided that they wanted to turn it into a sport as well. And as with any sport, competitions were needed, so with that, the Extreme Pokemon Race was established, where a Pokemon pulls a trainer on a skateboard to the finish line. The old man then introduced himself as Mr. Shelby, and states that the reason why so many trainers were training hard right now was because the champion event was coming up tomorrow, and also, Mr. Shelby happened to be a major part of the event, with a part of the race taking place at his house, explaining that the goal of the race was to start at the starting line, and then the contestants had to make their way over to his house and grab an egg from his house, and then from there, they would have to go back to the starting line, and the person who made it back to the starting line with an egg first wins. Misty stated her belief that Gary would likely win after seeing how skilled his Arcanine was, but Ash reminded Misty that he was going to enter the race to beat Gary, now not having any hesitations after learning that the Pokemon enjoyed the racing. Misty reminds Ash, though, that he would be very behind if he entered the race, since everyone else had been practicing, and he had no practice, and Brock reminded him that he didn't even have the skateboard necessary to race, also adding that since the competition was tomorrow, he may have missed registration. However, the old man then assures Ash and the gang that Ash wasn't too late for registration, and he even offered to give Ash and the gang a ride to his place using a Tauros with a wagon, and even clarified that he would help Ash practice for the race. Ash was overjoyed, immensely thankful for Mr. Shelby's offer, and gratefully accepted. So, Ash and the gang then hopped in Mr. Shelby's Tauros-driven cart that he had drove to the restaurant in, and make their way back to his house. Brock then remembers that Mr. Shelby said something about the racers having to retrieve an egg from his house, and questioned why he would have so many eggs, leading Mr. Shelby to reveal that his house also functioned as a Pokemon daycare. Ash didn't know what the fuck a Pokemon daycare was, so he butted in, questioning Mr. Shelby, leading Mr. Shelby to reveal that a Pokemon daycare was responsible for raising young Pokemon from eggs until they hatched and were ready to be given to trainers, explaining that people who operated a daycare were known as nesters, and their job was essentially to raise the egg until it hatched and then look after them on for a bit after that while they were still babies. Mr. Shelby then bragged that his daycare was the entire reason why Eggster Town was called Eggster Town, because a lot of people would drop off their own Pokemon eggs that they found and give them to the daycare to nurture, because they respected the daycare so much, and also knew that the area would be very beneficial for them, since the area around the daycare had very fresh air and a lot of space. Mr. Shelby also added that there was another reason why trainers would come to the daycare, which was so that the daycare people could look after their Pokemon, because much like a Pokemon Center, a daycare also functioned as a healing place for Pokemon, and added that people in rural areas that were farther away from towns with Pokemon centers usually relied on the daycare for their only source of treating their Pokemon, though admitted that it was far from ideal, since, especially around Egg Center Town, there was a lot of obstacles for people to simply walk by, adding that that was the entire reason why people started riding Pokemon in the first place, was so that they could have an easier way to get to the daycare. As Mr. Shelby bragged that his daycare was essentially the entire reasoning that Extreme Pokemon even existed as a sport. Mr. Shelby then stated that they were fast approaching his daycare, as he congratulated his Tauros on being able to pull the wagon so far. Sure enough, Ash and the gang then arrive at the daycare, and spot Mr. Shelby's wife outside, tending to a lot of eggs, as well as some of the new hatchlings, including some Wooper, Teddiursa, Apom, and Natu. Although Mr. Shelby's wife initially obviously questioned who the fuck Ash and the gang were, Mr. Shelby's wife happily greets Ash and the gang when Mr. Shelby explains the situation and introduces herself as Kimi. She goes to explain the daycare and what its functions were, only for Mr. Shelby to clarify that he had already explained all of that. So, upon learning that Mr. Shelby had already shared a lot of the details of the daycare, Kimi just decides to add on one more detail, being that her and her husband harvested their own eggs. They didn't just get eggs from a whole bunch of people around the town. Kimi then takes Ash and the gang inside to show them a lot of the eggs that they had, and they had a very vast collection of eggs that were different colors, and some even had different patterns. As Ash and the gang admire the eggs, they take a particular interest in an egg that was yellow with black stripes. Kimi then lets in some of the baby Pokemon that she was taking care of earlier, and they play with Ash and the gang, along with a Sentret, who jumps up into Mr. Shelby's arms. Mr. Shelby quickly takes Ash and the gang back outside so that he can help Ash practice for the race. Upon learning that Ash was going to enter the race, Mr. Shelby's wife wishes him good luck, and Mr. Shelby hands Ash his old skateboard and a collar to attach a Pokemon to it, stating that not only would he let Ash use these for practice, but for the actual race as well, which Ash greatly appreciated, especially since Mr. Shelby probably had a lot of great memories with his equipment. And now he was lending them to him. Ash did not let this new gift go to waste, as he instantly got on the skateboard and started riding down some nearby hills without any Pokemon attached, just trying to get a hang of the skateboard first. Mr. Shelby and his wife were immensely impressed with Ash's skills, and questions if it was really Ash's first time riding a skateboard, to which Ash reveals that, while it was technically his first time, he did used to mountain board on a piece of wood back in Pallet Town down some of the hills there. Anyways, Ash continued to ride down the hills by the daycare, and was still doing well, when unfortunately he accidentally hit a rock, and it sent him flying off of the board. He goes rolling down the hill, fearing where he would end up, when suddenly he is stopped rolling as he runs into something, being Gary's Arcanine, who happened to be down at the bottom of the hill with Gary. Gary reveals that he saw Ash falling down the hill, so he decided to rush to where he was falling to save him, leading Ash to thank Gary, although he was kind of in disbelief at the fact that Gary would actually try and save him. Before Ash can say anything more though, Gary questions what Ash was doing, as he noticed the skateboard by him, but Gary eventually came to the conclusion, without Ash having to specify, that Ash must have entered the race as well. Seeing this, Gary decides to go do some more training with his Arcanine, as he tells Ash he would not go easy on him during the race, and Ash says the same thing, confident that he would win. As Gary runs off to go train, Ash realizes that he had to pick his Pokemon that would pull his skateboard. He sees Pikachu jump off his shoulder and onto the skateboard, trying to ride it himself, indicating that he really wanted to be Ash's partner. However, Shelby then came down and advised Ash that since he could only pick one Pokemon and not switch it out during the race at any time, it had to be one with immense strength and immense character. Ash knew that all of his Pokemon had character, so it was just really up to the strength factor to determine which one he would choose. And as much as he wanted to choose Pikachu, he knew that Pikachu didn't have the brute strength to pull the skateboard, and neither did Cyndaquil and Totodile due to their size. So, with that, he decided to use Bayleaf as he sent her out. The two of them instantly started practicing, as Ash tied the collar to Bayleaf and held on as Bayleaf pulled the skateboard. After Bayleaf was used to pulling straight, Ash figured that they should practice turning and changing directions. However, the first time he ordered Bayleaf to change directions, he slid off of the skateboard since Bayleaf went too fast. He was frustrated and certainly wanted to give up, but he decided not to, as he got back on the board and Bayleaf was able to do a successful turn. Yay! Meanwhile, Meowth was watching Ash and Bayleaf train through his binoculars, and went to inform James and Jessie of this, only to find them sleeping, so he had to shout to wake them up, screaming angrily at them for slacking off during their spy job. Eventually, though, they did wake up and spied themselves, seeing just what Meowth did, Ash and Bayleaf training. James then gives Meowth a pamphlet for the Pokemon Extreme race that he had found laying on the ground earlier, and when Meowth looks through it, he realizes why James had given it to him. It was because James had probably thought that Ash was training for this race, after noticing how similar Ash's skateboard looked to the other skateboards. Meowth and James get excited at the prospect of there being a whole bunch of strong Pokemon at the race, since strong Pokemon were needed to pull the skateboards, and they imagined getting themselves a Machamp and a Dodrio. But their fantasies were then interrupted by a much less interesting Pokemon, Wobbuffet, who Jessie instantly recalled. However, she told James and Meowth that trying to capture too many Pokemon could be a waste of time, and they could end up failing, and said that they should instead just focus on catching one Pokemon, being the winner's Pokemon, since it would likely be the strongest anyways. James and Meowth agree to this idea, and they plan to infiltrate the race. Meanwhile, as Brock, Misty, Kimi, and Mr. Shelby were watching Ash train some more with Bayleaf, Brock, being interested in the daycare, asked to try some of Kimi's homemade Pokemon food that she fed to the babies, and he immediately thought it was exquisite for Pokemon. He thought it was so good that he requested that Kimi give some to Pikachu and Togepi, and Kimi happily agreed, as Misty fed it to them, along with some of the other baby Pokemon, such as Apom, Wooper, and Natu. As Ash continued to train with Bayleaf, it was getting very late, leading Shelby to come over and suggest that Ash take a break and give Bayleaf some food, which Ash obliged to, and Shelby then handed Ash an egg, revealing that that was the main reason why he actually came over to him in the first place. Ash is confused by the egg, leading Mr. Shelby to remind him that halfway through the race, Ash would have to carry an egg to the finish line, so he gave Ash a fake egg here that he could practice with, stating that he didn't have to worry about dropping it since there was no actual Pokemon inside. So, with that, Ash resumed his training with the dummy egg in hand to get ready for tomorrow. Shelby advises Ash to let his Bayleaf rest a little longer, as he had already proven that he was a pretty skilled racer, but Ash didn't want to give up on training yet. He wanted to make sure that he was fully prepared. The next day, Ash and the gang, along with Mr. Shelby and Gary and all the other competitors, arrived at the starting line, which was located near a building known as the Extra Extreme Pokemon Building, which was essentially a little hut for all the competitors where they could rest after the race every year. After all the contestants were lined up, and several of the audience members, such as Brock and Misty with Togepi and Pikachu in hand, went into the building to watch from the stands, and several other people, such as Kimi and Mr. Shelby, began watching from outside. The announcer of the race then explained the rules yet again, which of course were that people would start at the starting line, and then they would go over to Mr. Shelby's daycare, grab an egg, and then race back to the finish line with the egg still in hand. Adding that any possible route could be taken, so long as you ended up back at the starting line. Adding one more detail, that the winner would get a trophy. Shelby and Kimi then realized that they should probably head back to their daycare so that they could be ready for when people started showing up. So they go back to their daycare in the valley as the race was finally about to begin, with Ash and Gary smiling at each other before it began, determined to win. The race commenced as the starting lights turned from red to blue, indicating go, and all of the trainers rushed from the starting line as fast as they could to the daycare. Ash and Gary observed a lot of the competitors and their Pokemon. There was a Beedrill, Raticate, Nidoqueen, Vileplume, Machamp, Dodrio, Hitmonchan, Lickitung, Exeggutor, Rhydon, Scyther, and Granbull. The race overall starts off pretty calmly, but then one of the racers commands his Scyther to fly up, and as a result, it hits a lot of the other racers off of their boards, creating a dust cloud in the process, which in turn causes several other racers to fall off of their boards. While a lot of the competitors were decimated, a few of them, including both Ash and Gary, were able to emerge from the dust cloud unscathed and continue racing, as Ash and Gary then pass by each other. As they reach a more mountainous and hilly area, Gary and Arcanine take the lead, although Ash and Bayleaf quickly catch up, leading both Arcanine and Bayleaf to speed up in an attempt to try and outrun each other, as Gary taunts Ash, stating that he thought Ash would have been knocked out by the dust cloud, and was proud of him that he at least made it out of the dust cloud, and he wasn't even being sarcastic. Meanwhile, Team Rocket were flying overhead of Ash and Gary in their Meowth balloon, having infiltrated the race just as they had planned, and they debated on whether to take Ash's Bayleaf or Gary's Arcanine, knowing that they were both the two best competitors. But once they saw Gary and his Arcanine take the lead again, they decided on Arcanine, since he was now the best competitor. So they fired a net down from their balloon, capturing Arcanine inside, with Gary being knocked off of the Arcanine onto the ground in the process. Seeing Gary down, Ash stops his Bayleaf to check on Gary and make sure he was alright, which Gary confirms, although he confirms that Team Rocket had taken his Arcanine as he looks up to see the Meowth balloon, and tries to get up and go after it to retrieve Arcanine. However, Ash stops him, telling him that he would be faster due to being on Bayleaf, so he runs after Team Rocket's Meowth balloon on the skateboard, with Bayleaf still pulling him, and eventually, as Team Rocket were flying away, doing their motto in the process, Ash instructs Bayleaf to twirl around and launch him on his skateboard to a nearby ledge, and Bayleaf does this as Ash uses the momentum from the ledge to go flying up into the air on his skateboard, and he manages to touch the Meowth balloon with his skateboard, which pops it, sending the balloon crashing down, with Ash falling down with it. Meanwhile, Brock and Misty were watching the race as well as several programs being broadcasted into the building, and one of the programs was Mr. Shelby and his wife at their daycare talking about all of the eggs. Suddenly, Mr. Shelby quits talking and instead gasps in shock as he notices the Meowth balloon landing down on the daycare, and it ends up hitting the camera, cutting out the feed that Brock and Misty were watching as they saw the Meowth balloon, leading them to panic and hoping that everything was okay. Meanwhile, back at the daycare, the balloon had in fact landed, along with Ash and Team Rocket, and Ash was able to emerge from the remains of the balloon first, as Mr. Shelby immediately rushed to the balloon and pulled him out, as he was wondering what was going on. Ash doesn't answer Mr. Shelby's question, as he was too frazzled, merely asking the question himself, being if Arcanine was okay. Just then, Arcanine happily emerged from the remains of the Meowth balloon, as the net had been broken during the fall, so now Arcanine was free. When Ash realized that Arcanine was safe, he didn't have time to celebrate though, as Team Rocket quickly emerged from the Meowth balloon as well. However, they didn't go after the Arcanine again. They had other plans, as they managed to put a lot of the eggs that the daycare had into baskets, wanting to steal them, declaring that they were going to steal all of the eggs and then hatch them so they could use all of the Pokemon that came out inside. Shelby and his wife were greatly against this, obviously, as they warned Team Rocket that they wouldn't be able to raise the eggs properly since they didn't know what they were doing. But Team Rocket didn't care, as Jessie sent out her Arbok to distract everyone as her and James and Meowth tried to run away with all the eggs. Ash panicked as Arbok angrily approached him, and he realized that he didn't have any Pokemon to defend himself with, and was about to get eaten. However, in a Deus Ex Machina moment, Bayleaf then showed up, having followed the Meowth balloon, and Ash instantly commanded it to use Razor Leaf. Unfortunately, Arbok counters it by going for Poison Sting, which destroys all the leaves and hits Bayleaf, knocking her down. With Bayleaf down, Arbok took the opportunity to go in for a bite attack, but before it could bite, Gary arrived in a Deus Ex Machina moment. Well, we've already had a lot of Deus Ex Machina moments this episode, and he commanded his freed Arcanine to use Takedown, defeating Arbok. This leads Team Rocket to give up on fighting and run away while they still had the eggs, but unfortunately for Team Rocket, Bayleaf got back up and used Vine Whip to grab the eggs from Team Rocket's hands, and Team Rocket were so distracted by this that Arcanine was able to go up to them and hit them all with an extreme speed as well as a Flame Wheel, which sent them blasting off. With Team Rocket being gone, Gary thanks Ash for saving his Arcanine, though reminds him that they should probably get back to the race now that the interruption was gone, because all the other competitors were probably about to catch up. Sure enough, Ash and Gary can see the other competitors approach the daycare in the distance, ready to get their dummy eggs, so Mr. Shelby handed Ash and Gary their dummy eggs, and they continued on first. Ash and Gary are neck and neck at first, but Arcanine manages to speed up, therefore getting ahead of Bayleaf, leading Ash to realize that he was going to have to do something out of the box in order to catch up. He spots a nearby ledge, and tells Bayleaf to go up it like a ramp, and she does, launching Ash high in the air. Gary wonders where Ash went, as he was no longer beside him, as Ash then drops down from the ledge, now ahead of Gary. This led Gary to order his Arcanine to speed up even more as the finish line was approaching, meaning Gary took the lead despite Ash's best efforts. At the last second, though, Ash has Bayleaf use Vine Whip to dig the vines into the ground and launch herself forward, and she then stretches her head even more forward, meaning that Bayleaf was able to cross to the finish line first just by the leaf on her head, due to her head being extended. The audience, including Brock and Misty watching from the stands, cheered immensely at this very close race, as Ash actually managed to win and beat Gary with Bayleaf's Vine Whip strategy. With Ash having won, him and Gary went into the building, and Ash was presented with the winner's trophy. Although Gary was expectedly bitter at his loss at first, he still clapped for Ash, admitting that Ash did a good job, and admitting that Ash had actually raised a good Pokemon in Bayleaf. Yet another instance of Gary not being a total asshole. Yay! As Gary applauds Ash, all the other audience members applaud him as well, as Bayleaf is then awarded with her own medal as well, as Ash congratulates her, not wanting him to take all the credit, as Bayleaf did a lot of the work. After everyone had departed the stadium, Gary congratulated Ash in person, and stated that he had no regrets with how he handled things during the race, as he said goodbye and walked off to continue on his own journey. Ash and the gang go to continue on their journey the opposite way as well, but before they go, Mr. Shelby and his wife find Ash and give him a present as a reward for winning the race, being a blue Pokemon egg, and a Pokeball on top of the egg case, clarifying that Ash was supposed to use this Pokeball to catch the Pokemon when it hatched from the egg. Misty curiously questions what Pokemon would hatch from the egg, but Mr. Shelby's wife simply replies that it was a secret, and Ash and the gang were going to have to wait for it to hatch to see. So, with that, Ash and the gang set off to Mahogany Town, with Ash having the egg in his hand, wondering what was inside, as they said goodbye to Mr. Shelby and his wife.